We're going to talk about the different stocks available for the M79. MILSIG did a great job in designing a blaster platform that uses the three most popular types of HPA setups. This is the bottle-on stock. This is the default stock that comes with the M79. It's an adjustable buffer tube stock. Your tank just screws into the back. This is the most common setup for a lot of blasters. It fits on these smaller tanks, the 13 cubic inch tanks. So it really makes it a compact platform where you have a decent amount of air. One tank will last you a couple of games depending on how much you shoot. This is the remote stock. It is similar to the bottle-on stock. It just screws on to the back and it's adjustable. However, the remote line setup, you attach the tank to the back of your remote line and your tank can be on your gear, so it's not on the blaster, so your blaster is much more lightweight. You do have a coil that can get in your way depending on how you like to play and how active you are, but the tank being remote means you can have a much larger tank and not have to worry about running out of air. The smaller tank will last a couple of games, but I've had a larger tank last an entire day. So that's something to consider depending on how much you like to shoot and how conservative you are with your ammo. The last stock here is the CO2 stock. Like the other stocks, it screws onto the back and is adjustable. However, the CO2 stock uses 16 gram CO2 canisters that screw into the back of the stock. With one canister, you get about 40 shots, so it's enough for about one game. And this is the most compact and the most lightweight setup out of all of them because your air source is on your blaster, but it is a much smaller size and much lighter weight than a regular tank. And so if you are very agile and like to be very mobile in your games and you're a little bit more conservative with your ammo, this would be the ideal setup for you. Also, a good thing to note about the CO2 canisters is you do not have to refill them. You can just buy them in bulk at hunting stores or supermarkets. You can also buy them online and just buy a whole pack of them and just cycle through them as you use them. You do not have to worry about refilling them like you would a normal HPA tank. So if you don't have a scuba store or a paintball store that can fill your tanks for you, then CO2 would also be your best bet. Now we're going to look at each of the stocks individually and see how they're installed and see how quick it is to swap them out. We're going to start with the bottle-on stock. This is the default stock setup you get when you order your M79. When you first install your tank or switch out your stocks, you want to make sure you have your lubricant and a 2mm hex key to adjust the stock. So for the bottle-on stock, right out of the box, it's ready to go. What you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure that the stock is not too loose. Make sure all your screws and bolts are tightened down, and then you want to put some of this M79 MILSIG approved lubricant on the inside, and then install your tank. It fits most 13 or similar sized HPA tanks. And then you'd slide on your stock and you're good to go. It doesn't matter what size your tank is as long as it fits in the stock. So this is the MILSIG tank that they sent us with their regulator, but we also have a lot of other brands of tanks that all work. So yeah, that's the bottle-on stock. This is the default stock option you get when you order an M79. The stock just slides off and you can unscrew your tank and screw it back on. Now if you want to switch to a different stock option, you'll want to take off the bottle stock support arm from the bottom. And you have a little black spacer that can fall out, but you want to make sure you don't use that, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't do much. And then for a different kind of stock, you'll then just screw it on and put the screw back in. So this is the CO2 stock. I'm going to install it simply by screwing it onto the back. Now, before you do so, you'll want to make sure you do put some of the MILSIG approved oil onto your O-rings and onto your threads. That helps both lubricate the system when the air flows through and also protect your O-ring. There you go. And then that hole should line up. And then you can secure the stock by replacing the screw. And there you go. That is the CO2 stock. To load the stock, you'll slide it all the way forward so you can access this loading mechanism in the back. Unscrew it and put in your CO2 cartridge, 16 gram. These are ones that we got online. and they're fairly standard, but if your cartridge is too tight, it will not work well because it might get stuck. So you want to make sure your cartridge is a nice loose fit before you put it together. And again, you want to apply your MILSIG approved lubricant to your O-rings and your threads on the CO2 adapter, and then screw it in. This piece is knurled. This piece is knurled so you can grip it easier. Tighten it nice and hard. You want to make sure that this release screw is tightened all the way to the right, so it's all the way in, nice and tight. And then to engage and release your CO2 from the canister, you'll just slap this button with your hand, and you'll see that the button is now stiff, it's pressurized. Then you can reset your stock, and then you're ready to fire. Also, please note that CO2 on this design, MILSIG did not design the CO2 to work with the full auto. However, I've personally found that it works pretty fine with the full auto, but because the CO2 has less air than a normal tank, you'll burn through a lot of CO2 on full auto. So I would not recommend using full auto with CO2, although it is possible. You're not going to get very many shots out of it. Now after a little while, you run out of air, and then you can swap out your stock again. Do not remove the stock with the pressurized still. That's why you have a release screw, that if you didn't want to burn through all your ammo or just shoot it into the air, you could vent the excess gas. And once it is fully vented, then you can remove your CO2 cartridge. You slap in another one and you keep playing. So that is the CO2 stock. You've got your knurled loading tab, your release button, and your air release screw, and it is adjustable. Now if you wanted to use your different buffer tube, one with a padding or something a little more comfortable, you can just pull down this pin and the whole tube comes out, and then you can slide on a different tube. This is a pretty standard mil-spec tube, so if you have an airsoft or a different paintball stock, you can also slide it on as well. So that's the benefit of the CO2 stock that the Bottle On does not have, is you can adjust or you can switch out your tube because it's pretty standard. Now for the last stock, the remote line, we'll do the same thing. Here is the MILSIG default remote line stock. Like the CO2 stock, you can swap out the buffer tube. So these buffer tubes are actually the same thing. So the remote line stock is the simplest stock. It only has an inlet and that's it. Now the inlet does require 800 PSI. So most Nerf remote lines will not work with this setup. You'll have to make sure that you have 800 PSI coming from your tank into this line setup. Like all the other setups, you want to put some MILSIG approved oil on your O-rings and your threads and just screw it onto the back of your stock, the back of your M79. Make sure the holes line up and then attach it securely with your screw. And that's it, you're ready to rock and roll. Now this setup that MILSIG gives you is a standard paintball fitting. However, as standard is, it actually is not standard. It's standard for your fill nipples, so that's pretty standard. However, not every fitting is standard, so you want to check your remote line and make sure it is compatible. However, if you have a different line you want to do, maybe you want to hard wire or hard line your blaster, you could just remove this fitting with an 11mm wrench. So just unscrew that fitting there, and then you can replace it with either a hard wire line or another fitting. However, make sure it is rated for 800 PSI so you don't have an unhappy accident. So most push to connect lines would not work like in a lot of other Nerf HPA builds, but you can use a Fastener style connect. And that's just because now you have compatibility with both kinds of fittings and not just one, in case you happen to have this kind. Because this kind does not have a built-in back check, which is really important if you like to conserve your air. You can watch our other remote line videos to figure out how to set up your remote line if you're interested in that. However, most regular remote lines, you just attach to your tank, and then you have your line ready to go. However, with the default fitting, does not have a back check, so your air will just vent out if you engage this valve. However, with this setup, I can engage this valve, air will not leak out, and will only release air if it's connected to my blaster, which means I have more versatility and mobility if I need to switch setups in between games. So I'm going to attach my tank. Again, when you attach your tank to a thread, you want to make sure you put a little bit of HPA juice onto the threads and your O-rings. Helps protect them. Tighten that down, attach your air source, and then engage your air. You'll hear it engage. There you go. And then your tank can go somewhere on your gear, and you're ready to fire. I'm not wearing eye protection, which you should always do. Also, now that I'm connected properly into a large enough air source, I can turn on my power and go full auto with any luck. No, this one is just burst mode. I think that's way cool though. I think burst mode is way more practical than full auto anyway. Or you could just double tap the semi. And there you go. Those are all 3 stock options. Now the remote line is useful because then you can just disconnect it. Because it has a back check, it doesn't leak your air. If you use the default fitting, the paintball standard, doesn't have a built-in back check by default on this remote line, so it will leak air. But if you can just switch out your whatever fitting comes onto your remote line with one of a built-in back check, or get a remote line with a built-in back check, then you don't have to worry about leaking air. But that is all described in more detail on our other video about remote lines. Alright, that was all the stocks for the M79 by MILSIG, remote line, bottle on, and CO2. Choose whatever setup is best for you. If you don't have access to a place to refill HPA tanks, you want the CO2. If you like to have a medium number of shots, but still good mobility, go with the bottle on. If you like a high shot count and don't mind a remote line, go with the remote line. Get a high shot count in between and CO2. So pick what's best for you, try them out, get more than one if you'd like, and have fun nerfing. Also, always wear eye protection and play responsibly. Please, these are toys, but they are very fancy, expensive, and potentially dangerous toys. So please use caution so you can have as much fun as you can. Keep nerfing.